Dane Mercer never believed in ghosts, but as he crouched behind the rusted remains of an old supply truck, staring at the impossible figure in the clearing, he felt the kind of fear that made legends out of nightmares. The HFY were supposed to be gone, dead, extinct. Yet here she was, towering over 8 feet. Her body was encased in obsidian exoskeleton, the intricate ridges along her limbs catching the faint moonlight. Her arms, each ending in razor-sharp talons, twitched at her sides as she surveyed the ruins around her. A long, sinuous tail curled behind her, the tip lined with deadly spines. Her head, adorned with ridged plating instead of hair, tilted slightly as she scanned the remnants of a world that had tried to erase her kind. Her kind, the same species that had once brought humanity to its knees. Dane barely breathed. The war had ended 2 decades ago, but its scars remained. Entire cities had been reduced to uninhabitable wastelands, overgrown with mutated plant life where HFY biological weapons had tainted the soil. Millions had died, and those who survived learned one simple truth. If you saw a HFY, you ran. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to regret it. Yet he couldn't move. It wasn't just fear. It was something else. She wasn't behaving like the war machines he had seen in old footage, the merciless beings who tore through human ranks like predators culling prey. Those HFY moved with brutal efficiency, cutting down anything in their path without hesitation. But this one, she was still. Not the stillness of a hunter waiting to pounce, but something different. Hesitation, caution, and then she moved. Not toward him, but toward a pile of rubble a few feet away. Dane's eyes flicked to where she was looking, and his breath caught. A wounded animal, a wolf, half buried beneath fallen debris. Its flank rose and fell in uneven breaths. One of its hind legs twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood stained the cracked pavement beneath it. Dane braced himself. The HFY were carnivores. He had seen the footage, seen their serrated teeth, their lethal efficiency. The wolf would be dead in seconds. But she didn't strike. Instead, she crouched beside it, moving with an eerie, deliberate grace. One of her lower arms reached out, taloned fingers curling around the rubble. With effortless strength, she lifted the heavy debris, tossing it aside as if it weighed nothing. The wolf let out a weak, pained whimper, and then she did the unthinkable. She reached out again, not to kill but to touch. Her claws, sharp enough to tear through steel, moved with an impossible gentleness as she brushed them over the animal's fur. Dane's heart pounded. This wasn't the mindless killing machine the world had feared. This was something else entirely. He should leave. He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to get as far away from this place as possible, to pretend he never saw what he was seeing. If she noticed him, he was dead. No human had ever survived close contact with a war-class HFY. But his feet remained rooted in place. Because, against all logic, against everything he had ever been taught, he didn't see a monster. He saw something that shouldn't exist. Compassion. The HFY exhaled, the sound somewhere between a low chitter and a sigh, as she carefully gathered the injured wolf into her arms. Dane had seen this before in the old footage of human soldiers tending to wounded comrades. The way she held the animal, the way she adjusted her grip to keep from aggravating its injuries. There was no mistaking it. She was trying to help. His pulse roared in his ears. His fingers twitched toward the knife strapped to his belt. It was instinct, not aggression. A flimsy human weapon wouldn't save him if she decided to turn her attention to him. But she didn't. She was completely focused on the wolf. The air was thick with tension. The quiet hum of nocturnal insects the only sound in the night. The ruins stretched around them, the remnants of an old human outpost long abandoned after the war. Vines curled over shattered buildings, rusted vehicles lay forgotten, and the sky stretched wide and empty, the stars offering no comfort. Dane had spent years scavenging places like this, searching for old data drives, forgotten tech, anything worth trading. He had seen plenty of wreckage left behind by the war, but he had never seen this. A living HFY. He had always assumed they were extinct. The reports claimed their bodies had dissolved in the aftermath, their genetic code incompatible with Earth's atmosphere once their warships had fallen. But the reports had been wrong. His breath hitched as the Zalziware war class finally stirred, her head turning slightly. And then she looked at him. His stomach dropped. He had been careful, barely moving, barely breathing. And yet she had sensed him. Crimson eyes locked onto his. Dane went rigid, his instincts screaming at him to run. But something in her posture stopped him. She didn't attack. She just watched. It was unnerving. A creature of war, bred for destruction, standing mere feet away from him, studying him with unreadable intensity. His mouth was dry. Every muscle in his body tensed, waiting for the inevitable. But the killing strike never came. Instead, she lowered the wolf, placing it carefully on the ground before rising to her full height. The movement was slow, deliberate. Not a challenge. Not a threat. A test. Dane's mind raced. He had spent years navigating dangerous ruins, avoiding automated defenses, outsmarting scavengers willing to kill for supplies. He had faced death more times than he could count. But nothing had ever felt like this. His fingers twitched over the handle of his knife. It would be useless. If she decided to attack, he wouldn't stand a chance. But she wasn't attacking. She was waiting. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. He could still run. He could pretend he never saw her, report this to someone who could handle it. But he knew what would happen if he did. The moment anyone found out a Zalziwire war class had survived, the response would be immediate. And she would be hunted. For the first time, Dane looked past the armor, past the deadly talons and crimson eyes. And he saw something else. Loneliness. She was the last. Just like him. His heart pounded as he did something incredibly, unfathomably stupid. He stood up. The Zalziwire tensed, her lower arms shifting slightly. Not in aggression, but in readiness. A warning. Dane exhaled slowly, lifting his hands to show he held no weapons. His throat was dry, but he forced out the only words that made sense. "I'm not here to fight." Silence. She didn't understand him. Of course, she didn't. Human speech and Zalziwire vocalizations were fundamentally different. But something in his tone, his posture, made her pause. And then, to his utter shock, she moved. Not toward him. Not away. But forward just enough to close the gap between them. Close enough that he could see the subtle iridescence of her exoskeleton. The faint glow of bioluminescent veins beneath the surface. One of her upper arms twitched, then slowly, hesitantly lifted. "You said, a test." His stomach clenched. This was the moment. If he ran, she might see him as prey. If he reached for his knife, he was dead. So, against every instinct screaming in his mind, he reached out. His fingers brushed against her exoskeleton. Warm, smooth, pulsing faintly beneath his touch. The Zalziwire inhaled sharply, a low, strange sound vibrating through her chest. But she didn't pull away. Neither did he. And for the first time since the war ended, a human and a Zalziwire stood together, not as enemies, but as something else entirely. The silence stretched between them, fragile and uncertain. Dane felt his pulse hammering in his ears as his fingertips lingered against her exoskeleton. The warmth beneath the smooth surface surprised him. He had expected something cold, unfeeling like armor. But there was life there, a steady pulse beneath his fingertips, as if something deeper than instinct bound them in that moment. The Zalziwire remained still, her piercing crimson eyes locked onto his. Dane swallowed hard. What the hell was he doing? His entire life had been shaped by the war's aftermath. He had grown up in a world that whispered of monsters in the dark, creatures that had nearly wiped humanity from existence. The Zalziwire had been the nightmares of his childhood. The reason his father had never returned from the front lines. The reason his mother had spent years staring out the window of their small shelter, waiting for someone who would never come home. And yet, standing here, touching this being, this supposed nightmare, he couldn't feel fear. Only curiosity. She moved first. A slight twitch in her shoulders, a shift in weight. The arm he had touched lowered, her other set of limbs drawing close to her body as if she were unsure of what to do with them. Her tail flicked once against the cracked pavement before going still. She was watching him just as intently as he was watching her. Dane exhaled, lowering his hand. A soft chittering sound came from her throat, a complex vibration that almost sounded like speech. He had heard recordings of their language before, though no human had ever deciphered it. Their vocal structures were different. Some parts were ultrasonic, others layered in frequencies that human ears couldn't fully process. Even now, he couldn't understand her words, but he understood the intent. She wasn't threatening him. She was testing him. Dane licked his lips, glancing toward the injured wolf lying between them. Its breaths were still ragged, its limbs twitching weakly. She had moved the rubble for it, touched it gently. He had seen humans hesitate to show the same care to wounded animals. If she had wanted to kill him, she already would have. Dane made his choice. Slowly, he lowered himself into a crouch, careful not to make any sudden movements. He reached into the satchel at his side, his fingers brushing over the rough fabric until he found what he was looking for. A small medical kit. It wasn't much. Just some antiseptic, a roll of gauze, and a few old-fashioned stitches, but it was better than nothing. The HFY stiffened as he unzipped the pouch. Dane held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he murmured, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. She didn't attack. He took that as permission. Carefully, he turned his attention to the wolf. Its leg was broken badly. The wound was deep, but not beyond saving. He had patched up worse injuries before. His hands moved automatically, cleaning the wound as best as he could, carefully applying the gauze to stop the bleeding. The HFY watched every movement, her head tilting in a way that reminded him of a bird studying something unfamiliar. He worked in silence, focused on stabilizing the wolf. But he could feel her presence beside him, the heat of her body radiating in the cool night air. Minutes passed. Then slowly she moved. He tensed, but she didn't attack. Instead, one of her lower arms extended again, hovering near the wolf's side. Dane forced himself to remain still. He had no idea what she was doing, whether she would try to heal the creature or finish what nature had already started. But then, something extraordinary happened. A faint, shimmering glow traced along the lines of her exoskeleton, like veins pulsing with liquid light. Her talons hovered just over the wolf's injury, and where the glow met the wound, something changed. The wolf's shallow breathing grew steadier. His trembling subsided. Dane's throat went dry. HFY biochemistry had always been an enigma. Scientists had never been able to study them properly. The war had left no bodies behind, no chance to understand how they functioned. But now, right before his eyes, this war-class HFY was doing something that defied every expectation. Healing. Dane let out a slow breath. He didn't know if it was some biological function, a technology embedded in her very being, or something else entirely. But it didn't matter. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing a HFY as an enemy, as a relic of a war long past. He was seeing her. The glow faded, and she exhaled sharply, as if the effort had taken something from her. Dane hesitated, then did something reckless. He reached out, not toward her, but toward the wolf, pressing his fingers lightly against its side. Steady breathing, stronger, still injured but alive. Dane sat back on his heels, staring at her in something close to awe. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, even though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. But maybe, just maybe, she understood the meaning. The HFY war class tilted her head, her crimson eyes narrowing slightly. Then, in an almost imperceptible movement, she extended one of her hands, one of the smaller ones, more delicate than the others. Dane froze. It took him a moment to realize what she was doing. It was an offering, a question, a choice. His breath caught as he stared at the outstretched talons, still sharp enough to slice through flesh, but now held in something close to hesitation, or trust. This was madness. But then again, so was war. And for the first time, Dane wondered if the greatest mistake of that war had been humanity's failure to see what lay beyond the monster. He reached out, His fingers brushed over her palm. Warmth. A low, chittering hum vibrated through her chest. Something strange but not hostile. She had accepted his touch. Dane didn't know what this meant, what the hell he was getting himself into. But one thing was certain. The world had feared her, and he was the only one who had dared to see beyond it. You said. The night stretched on, thick with unspoken tension. Dane sat beside the wounded wolf, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. His hand still tingled from where he had touched her. He had expected something alien, cold, hard, something that would remind him of the war. Instead, her palm had been warm, textured with fine ridges, almost like the calloused hands of a soldier. She was watching him again, her crimson eyes flickering in the dim light. Dane swallowed. He should have been afraid. He should have run. But instead, he did something even more reckless. He spoke. I don't know if you can understand me, he said slowly. But I don't think you're what they say you are. Her head tilted slightly, the movement almost too smooth, too controlled. Dane exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had spent years learning how to read people, how to spot lies, fear, anger. It had been a necessity, growing up in the ruins of a world that had barely survived. And yet he couldn't read her. She wasn't human, but she wasn't a monster either. The wolf shifted beside him, letting out a low whimper. His breathing was stronger now, steadier. Dane had no idea how her strange ability worked, but it had saved the animal. That was undeniable. He turned back to her. She hadn't moved. He studied her, taking in the sharp angles of her exoskeleton, the way her secondary arms remained tucked close to her body while her primary limbs rested at her sides. She was still poised, still wary. But she wasn't hostile. Carefully, Dane pulled a small ration bar from his satchel. He doubted she would eat human food, but it was the only thing he had to offer. He unwrapped it, then held it out toward her. She didn't move at first. Seconds passed. Then, with deliberate slowness, she extended one of her smaller hands. Her talons hovered over the food for a moment before she took it. Dane held his breath as she inspected the strange offering. Then, without warning, she lifted the ration to her mouth and bit into it. He almost laughed. Of all the things he had expected, watching a Zalziwire eat a dry, tasteless protein bar hadn't been one of them. She made a strange, clicking sound in the back of her throat. Dane smirked. Yeah, tastes like cardboard, doesn't it? She blinked at him, then took another bite. Dane shook his head, running a hand through his hair. What the hell was he doing? Whatever this was dangerous. If anyone saw them, if anyone knew what had just happened, his grip tightened on the empty ration wrapper. He had grown up in the aftermath of the war. He had heard the stories, seen the recordings, lived in the ruins of a world that had barely survived their kind. And yet, she had saved the wolf. She had let him touch her. And now she was sitting here, eating a damn ration bar like they were sharing a meal. Dane glanced at her again, his mind racing. Maybe it was just survival. Maybe she was alone, injured, desperate. Maybe this was all some elaborate strategy to lower his guard. Or maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who had spent years being feared. The silence stretched between them again. Dane let out a slow breath. I should probably be terrified right now. She didn't react, just watching him with those sharp, crimson eyes. He sighed. But I'm not. Something shifted in her posture, subtle, but there. She leaned forward slightly, as if studying him just as much as he was studying her. Then, to his utter shock, she spoke. Her voice was unlike anything he had ever heard. Layered, resonant, almost like two voices speaking at once. The words were strange, twisted in ways his ears struggled to process. But he understood one thing. His name. Dane. His breath caught. She had repeated his name. Not perfectly, not like a human would, but enough to make his skin prickle. She had been listening. Dane swallowed hard. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, carefully, she made a low, clicking sound deep in her throat. It was layered, complex, something no human mouth could replicate. Dane frowned. I don't think I can say that. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Then, after a moment, she tilted her head slightly and made another sound, shorter, more deliberate. A simpler version. Something he could say. Zyra? He guessed. A long silence. Then a single, slow blink. He had gotten it right. Dane exhaled. His pulse was still hammering, but he felt something shift between them. A fragile thread. An understanding. He didn't know where this would lead, but he did know one thing. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. Dane never would have imagined that his life would change in a single night. He had expected fear. He had expected death. But what he had found instead was something far stranger, understanding. Zyra sat across from him now, her crimson eyes locked onto his. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something neither of them had words for. He had seen her as a monster once. The whole world had. And yet she had saved a life too, if he counted his own. The wolf stirred beside them, its breathing even, its wounds no longer life-threatening. Dane reached out, running a hand over the animal's fur. It didn't flinch away. Zyra watched him closely. They were no longer enemies. Dane exhaled, turning his gaze to her once more. You're not what they say you are. She didn't respond, at least not with words. But she didn't have to. The way she held herself, the way she remained still instead of recoiling from him, spoke volumes. She had spent her life being feared, being hated, and maybe, just maybe, she had never asked for any of it. Dane glanced up at the sky, the stars stretching endlessly above them. He had always felt small beneath them, like a single grain of sand in an uncaring universe. But tonight was different. Tonight he wasn't alone. Zyra shifted, tilting her head slightly as if contemplating something. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, she extended her hand once more. It was a silent question, a choice. Dane hesitated only for a moment before reaching out. His fingers met hers. Warmth. This time she didn't flinch. This time it wasn't hesitation, it was acceptance. A soft, vibrating hum escaped her throat, something deep and resonant. It wasn't a sound of warning. It wasn't a sound of threat. It was something else entirely. Dane's lips twitched into a small smile. Guess that means I passed the test, huh? Zyra blinked at him slowly, then gave the faintest tilt of her head. Dane didn't know where this road would lead. He didn't know what the world would say if they saw what was happening here, if they saw what he saw. But for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't care. The world had feared her, but he had dared to see beyond the monster. And in the end, he had found something far more human than anyone had ever imagined.